The morning light streaming through Riverside Coffee's tall windows had turned the whole place golden, and I was trying to savor these small moments of peace with Lucas before another impossible day began. My hands moved through the air as I signed to my 8-year-old brother about his upcoming school project, watching his dark eyes light up with excitement as he signed back about building a volcano. The smell of fresh espresso wrapped around us like a warm blanket, and the gentle murmur of morning conversations created that perfect coffee shop atmosphere where everything felt possible for just a little while. Lucas's small hands fumbled through the sign for explosion, making me smile despite the exhaustion pulling at my bones from working 2 jobs and still barely making rent. Then the door burst open with such violence that the bell above it shattered, and 3 men stumbled inside, their faces twisted with fear and something darker. Tables overturned as they crashed through the morning crowd, sending ceramic mugs exploding against the tile floor and scalding coffee spraying across expensive suits and casual weekend wear. "Everyone down!" one of them shouted, his voice raw with desperation, and I watched in horror as he pulled something from his jacket that caught the morning light with cold, metallic certainty. My body moved before my mind could catch up. Instinct born from 8 years of being Lucas's only protection, overriding everything else. I grabbed my brother and pulled him behind me, feeling his small body trembling as his fingers clutched at my sweater with the kind of grip that comes from pure terror. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through, but my hands stayed steady as I signed to Lucas where he could see them pressed against my chest. "Don't be scared. I've got you." My fingers formed the words we'd practiced for emergencies I prayed we'd never face, and I felt him nod against my back, even as his whole body shook. The coffee shop had transformed from our safe morning ritual into chaos, with people screaming and diving under tables, while one of the men grabbed the barista and another smashed the pastry case with his elbow. Glass rained down like deadly snow, and I tucked Lucas's head down, covering him with my body, as screams echoed off the exposed brick walls that had seemed so charming just moments ago. I could smell his strawberry shampoo mixed with the bitter scent of spilled coffee, and something else, something metallic and wrong, that I realized was blood from someone's cut hand. Lucas's fingers moved against my side, signing the question I dreaded. "Are we going to die?" My hands found his in the chaos, squeezing once, twice, 3 times. Our secret code for "I love you," for "you're safe," for "I will never let anything hurt you, even if it costs me everything." The door opened again, but this time there was no violence in the movement, just a calm, deliberate push that somehow carried more weight than the chaos that had preceded it. A man stepped through, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant, like winter itself had taken human form and decided to visit our destroyed coffee shop on this October morning. He was tall, easily 6'3", wearing a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it must have cost more than 3 months of my rent, and everything about him screamed power in a way that made the 3 men who had been terrorizing us suddenly look like children caught stealing cookies. His dark hair was immaculate despite the morning wind, with just a touch of silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, and when his eyes swept across the room, I felt the assessment in that gaze like a physical touch. Those eyes were green, not the soft green of spring leaves, but the deep green of a forest, moments before a storm, and they catalogued everything with terrifying efficiency. 4 men flanked him, spreading out with military precision, their hands resting inside their jackets in a way that left no doubt about what they carried. But it was the man in the center who held all the power in the room. The 3 who had burst in moments ago froze completely, and I watched color drain from their faces as recognition and fear transformed their expressions from desperate to defeated. Complete silence fell over the coffee shop like a heavy blanket, broken only by Lucas's small whimper against my back, and I squeezed his hand again while my own heart did something complicated in my chest. This man, whoever he was, exuded control the way other people exuded cologne, and I found myself unable to look away, even though every instinct screamed that drawing his attention would be dangerous. The barista had stopped mid-motion, a cloth frozen in her hand above a spill, and even the people huddled under tables seemed to hold their breath. He commanded the space itself, as if gravity worked differently in his presence, as if the very air rearranged itself to accommodate him. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, and his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and dark with an undercurrent that promised it could burn. "You're making a scene." The words were soft, almost conversational, but they carried absolute authority that made strong men flinch. My breath caught in my throat, and I hated that it wasn't entirely from fear, that some traitorous part of me noticed the sharp line of his jaw and the way he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He hadn't looked at me yet, his attention focused on the three men with the kind of intensity that suggested he was deciding their fates with every passing second, and I pressed myself harder against the overturned table, trying to make Lucas and myself invisible. But even as I tried to disappear, I couldn't stop cataloging details about this stranger who had transformed our terror into a different kind of tension entirely, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the way his men responded to the slightest movement of his hand like he was conducting a silent orchestra of violence. Lucas moved before I could stop him, his curiosity overriding his fear the way it always did, and he peeked around my shoulder with those wide dark eyes that missed nothing. The stranger's gaze shifted immediately, landing on us with the precision of a predator noticing movement, and I felt my whole body tense as those green eyes locked onto my brother's small face. Lucas's hands flew into motion against my chest where I could see them, signing frantically with the jerky movements that meant he was scared, and I watched his fingers form the question that made my heart stop. "Is that man going to hurt us?" I opened my mouth to respond, to sign back reassurance I didn't feel, but before my hands could move, the impossible happened. The stranger's hands lifted from his sides, and his fingers began to move through the air with fluid precision, forming signs in perfect ASL that were so unexpected I actually gasped. "No, little one," his hands said with a gentleness that completely contradicted everything about his dangerous presence. "You're safe." The shock that went through me was absolute, like touching a live wire. Because this man who commanded rooms and made grown men freeze in terror, knew sign language, actually knew it well enough that his grammar was flawless, and his movements had the natural flow of someone truly fluent. Lucas's eyes went wide as saucers, and I felt his body shift against mine from fear to fascination in the way only children can manage. The stranger's expression softened when he looked at my brother, just the barest change around his eyes and mouth, but it transformed his entire face from terrifying to something almost human. My mind raced, trying to make sense of this impossible moment, this dangerous man signing to my deaf brother in a destroyed coffee shop, while his men dealt with the three criminals who had started this whole nightmare. Lucas's hands moved again, bolder now, forming the question that I desperately wanted answered too. "How do you know our language?" The stranger's jaw tightened slightly, and something that looked like old pain flickered across his features before he controlled it. His hands moved again, and I found myself leaning forward, despite every instinct telling me to grab Lucas and run. "Someone I loved taught me." His fingers formed the words with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone who radiated such controlled danger. The past tense of that statement hung in the air, heavy with implications, with loss, with a story I suddenly needed to understand. I realized I was staring at his hands, at the way they moved through signs with muscle memory that spoke of years of practice, of conversations held in silence, of love expressed through gestures instead of words. Those were not the hands of someone who learned ASL from a book or a class. They were the hands of someone who had lived with it, needed it, cherished it. Lucas signed back before I could stop him, his natural friendliness overcoming his earlier fear. My sister takes care of me. She knows everything. The stranger's eyes finally moved to my face fully, and the intensity of that gaze made my breath catch for the second time in as many minutes, made heat flood my cheeks even as my rational mind screamed about danger and criminals and the wrongness of this entire situation. The stranger's men moved with frightening efficiency, and within seconds the three criminals were being hauled toward the back exit with the kind of professional brutality that suggested this was far from their first extraction. I held Lucas tighter as we watched from behind our overturned table, unable to look away from the choreographed violence playing out in the morning light that still streamed through the broken windows like nothing had changed. The stranger himself approached us slowly, his expensive shoes crunching over shattered ceramic and broken glass. And when he reached our table, he did something I didn't expect. He crouched down, lowering himself to Lucas's eye level with a fluid movement that spoke of athletic grace, and his hands began to move again in that perfect ASL that still seemed impossible. "Brave boy," he signed, his expression serious but warm. "Protecting your sister like that." Lucas beamed despite everything, and I felt my heart do something complicated as this dangerous man praised my brother with genuine respect rather than the condescension most adults used. The stranger's hands continued moving, and I read the signs even as Lucas did. "There's glass everywhere. You should help your sister stand, so neither of you gets hurt." Lucas nodded solemnly and tugged at my sleeve, trying to help me up with his small strength, and I realized we couldn't hide behind this table forever. The stranger stood smoothly and extended his hand to me, palm up, an offer, not a demand, and I stared at it for a long moment. His hand was broad and strong, with neat nails and a few small scars across the knuckles that told stories I probably didn't want to know, and I could see calluses on his palm that suggested he did more than sign business documents. I hesitated, my mind screaming warnings about taking anything from a man who clearly operated outside the law. But Lucas was pulling at me, and there really was glass everywhere, and I could feel my legs shaking from the adrenaline crash. I placed my hand in his, and the contact sent electricity shooting up my arm like I'd grabbed onto something live and dangerous. His hand was warm, so warm it seemed to burn through my skin, and strong enough that he pulled me to my feet with almost no effort, steadying me when I wobbled slightly. Those calluses pressed against my palm, rough spots that spoke of violence or hard work or both, and I found myself cataloging every sensation even as I knew I should pull away. The morning light, streaming through the broken window, caught the silver at his temples and made his green eyes almost luminous. And I realized with a start that he was strikingly handsome, in a way that seemed unfair for someone so clearly dangerous. Coffee had spilled across the marble floor in dark rivers, and curious onlookers were being efficiently ushered out by his men, their protests dying the moment they met the stone-faced stares of the men in suits. He released my hand slowly, and I immediately missed the warmth even as I hated myself for noticing. "Are either of you hurt?" he asked, his voice that same whiskey smooth that seemed to vibrate in my chest, his eyes scanning us both for injuries with the thoroughness of someone trained to assess damage. One of his associates approached quickly, a shorter man with sharp eyes who handed over a phone and what looked like a manila file without saying a word. The stranger took them with one hand, his eyes flicking down to whatever was on the screen, and I watched his expression shift almost imperceptibly as he read something there. Then his gaze returned to me with a new intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness, like he was seeing me differently now, like whatever information he'd just received had changed the equation somehow. His men were moving through the coffee shop with practiced efficiency, and I noticed they were actually cleaning up, righting tables and sweeping glass, while simultaneously encouraging the remaining customers to leave with the kind of polite menace that left no room for argument. The shop owner started to protest about the damage, his voice rising shrilly about insurance and police reports, but one of the men in suits leaned close and whispered something that made all the color drain from the owner's face, and his mouth snapped shut like a trap. The stranger reached into his jacket, and I tensed instinctively until I saw he was only pulling out a wallet of buttery black leather that probably cost more than my car. He withdrew a card, cream-colored and heavy stock, holding it out to me between two fingers. "If you or your brother need anything," he said, his eyes holding mine with uncomfortable intensity. "Anything at all." I stared at the card like it might bite me, confusion warring with suspicion and that inexplicable pull of attraction I desperately wanted to ignore. Why would this clearly powerful and obviously dangerous man care whether Lucas and I needed anything? We were nobody, just a struggling waitress and her deaf kid brother caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. I managed to take the card with fingers that trembled slightly, and I hated that weakness. Hated that he could probably see every emotion playing across my face. "We're fine," I forced out, my voice rougher than I intended. "Thank you for—" I trailed off, because what exactly was I thanking him for? For stopping the men who had terrorized us, for knowing sign language and being gentle with Lucas, for looking at me. Like I was something precious when I knew I was just another complication in whatever dangerous world he inhabited. The words stuck in my throat as his green eyes held mine, and I felt like he could see straight through to every secret fear and desperate hope I carried. "For making sure you stayed safe," he finished for me, his voice dropping lower, more intimate somehow despite the chaos around us. "The city can be dangerous, especially for those who can't hear threats coming." His gaze flicked to Lucas, who was watching our exchange with open curiosity, then back to me. "That card has my private number. Use it if you need protection, resources, anything." The way he said protection made it sound like both an offer and a promise, and I clutched the card tighter, feeling the raised lettering under my thumb. Around us, his men had nearly finished their work, the coffee shop looking almost normal except for the broken window and a few overturned chairs, and I realized with a start that there would be no police, no official reports, no record that any of this had happened. That night, after putting Lucas to bed in our small two-bedroom apartment, after reading him 3 stories in sign and kissing his forehead, and watching him curl around the stuffed rabbit he'd had since he was 3, I finally let myself look at the card I'd shoved deep in my pocket. The apartment was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of our building settling, and Mrs. Chen's television bleeding through the thin walls. And I sat on our threadbare couch under the single lamp that worked, turning that heavy cream cardstock over in my hands. The name embossed in elegant script seemed to mock me with its simplicity. Dante Moretti, followed by a phone number and nothing else. No title or company or explanation. I pulled out my laptop, the one I'd bought secondhand 3 years ago that took forever to boot up, and waited while the screen glowed to life in the darkness of our living room. My fingers hesitated over the keys for a moment before I typed his name into the search bar, and then my blood ran cold as the results populated across the screen. Article after article, some from major newspapers, but most from smaller publications and crime blogs, all dancing around the same truth with careful language designed to avoid lawsuits. Dante Moretti, alleged head of the Moretti crime family, suspected of racketeering, under investigation by the FBI for the 3rd time in 5 years, with charges that never seemed to stick, connected to everything from gambling operations to protection rackets across the entire East Coast. I clicked through with shaking hands, reading about suspected murders that could never be proven, about business owners who suddenly closed shop and left town, about rival families who tried to move into his territory and simply disappeared. One article from 2 years ago had a grainy photo of him leaving a courthouse, looking exactly as controlled and dangerous as he had this morning, and the caption mentioned yet another investigation that had collapsed when witnesses refused to testify. My stomach churned as I realized the coffee shop had been in his territory, that those 3 men had probably been stealing from him or operating without his permission, that the violence I'd witnessed was just another Tuesday in his world. I let a mafia boss touch my brother. The thought screamed through my mind as I stared at the laptop screen. I let him crouch down and sign to Lucas. Let him see how much my brother means to me. Let him hand me a card with his private number like we were friends or something more. I took his card, actually put it in my pocket, and brought it home like some kind of souvenir. And God, what if he looked into us the way I was looking into him? What if he knew about the medical bills and the 2 jobs and the fact that we were barely surviving? What if he saw us as weak or useful or targets? The photos of Lucas and me covered our walls, secondhand frames holding memories we couldn't afford to print at a real photo shop, and our furniture was all thrift store finds that I'd cleaned and repaired myself. The paint was peeling near the windows where moisture got in during winter, and I could see every place where poverty showed through our attempts at making this place a home. My hands were shaking as I clicked through more articles, learning about the Moretti family's history, about Dante's father who had built the empire before dying in circumstances the articles only hinted at, about the rumors that Dante was even more ruthless than his predecessor. I closed the laptop and looked at the stack of bills on our kitchen table, the pile that grew faster than I could shrink it no matter how many double shifts I pulled or how carefully I budgeted every dollar. Medical bills from Lucas's childhood illness when he was 4 and his immune system had crashed, leaving us with debt that felt insurmountable even after payment plans and charity care applications. The funeral expenses from 6 months ago sat near the top, and I still couldn't look at those without feeling like someone had carved out my chest with a dull knife. Mom's service had been simple, but even simple wasn't cheap when you had nothing. Rent past due notices in increasingly urgent language. The landlord had been patient, but patience only stretched so far, and I was running out of miracles to pull from empty pockets. I worked 2 jobs, my day shift at the nonprofit for deaf children, where I made barely above minimum wage, but at least felt like I was making a difference, and my night shifts waitressing at Romano's, where handsy businessmen left decent tips if I smiled through their comments. I was 26, but I felt ancient, like I'd lived several lifetimes in the 6 months since Mom died, and left me solely responsible for Lucas, for keeping him safe and fed and happy, and never letting him know how close we were to losing everything. He was everything to me, all the family I had left in a world that seemed designed to crush people like us, and the weight of that responsibility sat on my shoulders like physical pressure that never eased. The photo of Mom sat on our bookshelf, her hands frozen mid-sign in a picture I'd taken 2 years ago when she'd been laughing at something Lucas had done, and I could still see the joy in her face, the strength that had carried us through Dad leaving when Lucas's deafness was diagnosed at 18 months old. Our father had looked at his son, at the diagnosis, at the future he'd imagined crumbling, and he'd simply walked away like we were defective products he could return for a refund. Mom had been deaf herself, born that way, and she'd taught me ASL before I could speak English, raising me in both worlds so I could be Lucas's bridge when he needed one. She'd made me promise in those last weeks, when the cancer was eating her alive, and we both knew there was no more time, keep Lucas safe, give him opportunities, never let him feel less than anyone just because he experiences the world differently. I'd held her hand and promised, signing the words so she could see them clearly, and I'd meant every syllable, even though I had no idea how I'd keep that promise on my own. Now I sat in our cramped apartment with peeling paint and second-hand furniture that I'd scrubbed until it shined, surrounded by the evidence of our struggle, and I had a Mafia boss's card burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't afford dangerous attention, couldn't risk anything that might disrupt the precarious balance I'd achieved, couldn't let Lucas anywhere near the kind of violence and corruption that seemed to follow men like Dante Moretti. But even as I thought it, I remembered how gentle he'd been with my brother, how his hands had moved through signs with practiced ease, how he'd looked at Lucas like he actually saw him as a person rather than a disability, and that scared me more than anything. Over the next 3 days, I started noticing things that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my heart race with a paranoia I couldn't shake. The same black car, a sleek sedan with tinted windows, parked near Lucas's school when I dropped him off in the morning, and again when I picked him up in the afternoon, never in the exact same spot, but always within view of the entrance. A man in an expensive suit appeared at the nonprofit on Tuesday, claiming to be a potential donor interested in our programs, but his eyes followed me through the building with an intensity that had nothing to do with charitable giving. And when my supervisor asked for his contact information, he gave a number that went straight to voicemail. At Romano's during my Thursday night shift, a customer I'd never seen before left a $100 tip on a $30 bill, and I'd felt his eyes on me the entire time he was there, watching my movements with the kind of careful attention that made my skin crawl. My paranoia increased with each incident until I was checking over my shoulder constantly, changing our route home from Lucas's school, taking different streets, even though it added 15 minutes to our walk. I considered going to the police, actually stood outside the station for 10 minutes on Wednesday. But what would I even say? That a man had given me his card after helping us, that I'd seen the same car twice, that someone had tipped me well and looked at me. I hadn't done anything wrong, but neither was being watched actually a crime. The autumn rain that had been falling steadily since Monday matched my mood perfectly. Constant gray skies that made the whole city feel oppressive and claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in, and there was nowhere safe to hide. Every shadow seemed threatening, every stranger potentially dangerous, and I hated that Dante Moretti had done this to me, had made me afraid in my own neighborhood, suspicious of kindness, paranoid about protection I wasn't sure I needed or wanted. The feeling of being trapped intensified with each passing hour, like I was caught in a web I couldn't see but could definitely feel tightening around Lucas and me. By Friday night I was exhausted from hypervigilance and the constant weight of watching for threats, and Lucas noticed because of course he did. My brother saw everything even if he couldn't hear it. We were having dinner, mac and cheese from a box because it was cheap and he loved it, when his small hands started moving in the lamplight. "You seem scared," he signed, his dark eyes too perceptive for an 8-year-old. "What's wrong?" I forced a smile I didn't feel, and signed back quickly, trying to keep my hands steady so he wouldn't see how much they wanted to shake. "Nothing, mi amor," my fingers formed the lie. "Just tired from work, you know how it is." He didn't look convinced, his bottom lip pushing out slightly the way it did when he knew I wasn't telling him the whole truth, but he let it go and returned to his dinner. I pushed pasta around my plate and tried not to think about green eyes and perfect sign language, about men in black cars and generous tippers, about the business card I'd hidden in my drawer but couldn't bring myself to throw away, about whether I was being protected or hunted and which possibility scared me more. I arrived home from my waitress shift at midnight to find Dante Moretti sitting on my building's front steps like some kind of designer gargoyle, and my heart stopped completely before lurching into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to cardiac arrest. He wore an expensive charcoal coat that was soaked through from the rain that had been falling steadily all evening, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and there were no bodyguards visible, but I knew with absolute certainty they were there, watching from the shadows, covering every angle. He'd been waiting. That much was obvious from how wet he was, how his breath clouded in the cold October air, how he looked up at my approach with those green eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. My fear spiked immediately, flooding my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake and my vision sharpen. But then anger rushed in hot on its heels because how dare he show up at my home after days of having me watched and followed and studied like I was some kind of specimen. "You've been having me followed," I said, my voice coming out harder than I'd ever heard it. "Watched. Men in cars and suits pretending to be donors and customers who tip too well. Leave us alone." He stood slowly, unfolding that tall frame with controlled grace despite the rain and the late hour, and water ran down his face like tears he'd never actually shed. "I needed to be certain," he said simply, as if that explained everything. As if invading my privacy and scaring me half to death was perfectly reasonable. The street behind me was rain-slicked and empty, a broken streetlight casting our confrontation in intermittent darkness, and graffiti covered the brick of my building in layers of spray paint that told the story of my neighborhood's struggles. His expensive presence was absurd against all this poverty, like placing a diamond in a pile of rocks and expecting it not to draw attention. And I hated him for making me aware of the contrast, for making me see my life through his eyes. "Certain of what?" I demanded, wrapping my arms around myself against the cold, and the fear, and the inexplicable pull I felt toward this dangerous man. "That you weren't involved," he said, taking a step closer, and I forced myself not to retreat. "That you were who you appeared to be. That your presence in that coffee shop was actually coincidence, and not some elaborate setup." His eyes held mine with uncomfortable intensity, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted him to find. "You are," he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate despite the rain and the distance between us. "You're remarkable." The word hit me like a physical blow, because nobody had called me remarkable in my entire life. I was just Maya, who worked too hard and worried too much, and couldn't save her mother, or give her brother everything he deserved. "I have all the information now," he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Everything about you and Lucas, your jobs, your bills, your mother's death, your father's abandonment, every struggle you've faced alone. I felt violated and exposed, knowing he'd dug into my life, uncovered all my failures and fears, seen every weakness I tried so hard to hide." "You had no right," I whispered, hating how my voice broke. "We're nobody to you, just people who happened to be in the wrong place." His expression shifted slightly, something that might have been regret or something darker. "You became somebody the moment those men put you in danger in my territory," he said. "The moment I saw your brother sign and remembered." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, "when I realized you might be used against me." I demanded answers then, my anger overriding my fear because I was so tired of being powerless, of being studied and investigated like my life was just data for him to collect. "Why do you know sign language?" I asked, my voice rising despite the late hour. "Why do you care about some waitress and her brother? What possible reason could you have for any of this?" His mask cracked slightly, just a hairline fracture in that controlled facade, and I saw something raw flash across his face before he locked it down again. "I had a sister," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something. "Deaf from birth, I learned for her." The past tense hit me like a fist to the stomach, and suddenly all the pieces started falling into place. The way he'd looked at Lucas, the gentleness in his signs, the pain that flickered behind his eyes when he used ASL. His grief was carefully controlled, but visible now that I knew to look for it. Held behind walls that probably took years to build, but showing through the cracks like light through a broken window. My anger softened despite every instinct telling me to stay hard, to keep my distance, to remember who and what he was. "Had?" I asked more gently, and I watched him flinch at the word like I'd struck him. "She died," he said, staring past me into the rain and the darkness 10 years ago, and when he looked back at me, his eyes held an ocean of grief he'd probably never let himself fully feel. "Lucas," he continued, his voice rougher now, "when I saw him sign, heard you respond, I haven't seen ASL used with such love since her." The admission hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I realized this dangerous man who commanded criminal empires and made grown men disappear had a wound as deep as mine, a loss that had shaped him in ways I was only beginning to understand. The rain continued falling around us, soaking through my uniform and making me shiver, but something had shifted in the air between us, the hostility transforming into something more complex. We were both people who had loved someone vulnerable, who had learned to communicate in silence, who carried the weight of being someone's entire world and the crushing guilt of not being enough to save them. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to my righteous fury about being watched and investigated. But how could I, when I saw my own pain reflected in his eyes, when I understood suddenly that Lucas reminded him of the sister he'd lost and couldn't protect? Your sister, I started, then stopped, not knowing what question to ask or if I had the right to ask anything. Isabella, he supplied, and the name came out like a prayer or a curse. She was 16, caught in crossfire meant for me, died in my arms while I signed promises I couldn't keep about saving her. His hands had moved unconsciously into the sign for sister as he spoke her name, and I watched those dangerous hands form the gentle gesture with a tenderness that broke something inside me. She would have liked Lucas, he added almost to himself, would have loved his spirit, his curiosity, the way he sees the world. I understood then that his interest in us wasn't just about danger or territory, or whatever Mafia reasons I'd imagined. It was about a man seeing ghosts in a coffee shop and being unable to walk away from the chance to protect what he'd failed to protect before. Dante's expression hardened, becoming all business again, and he moved us under the building's awning where the rain couldn't reach, though we were both already soaked through. The men in the coffee shop worked for the Kozlov family, he said, his voice taking on an edge that reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. Russian rivals. There's tension escalating into war over territory and operations, and anyone seen with me becomes a target. He paused, letting that sink in, then added with deliberate emphasis, "You were seen, you and Lucas, with me protecting you, speaking to you, and now the Kozlovs will want to know why you matter." My legs nearly gave out as the implications crashed over me like a wave, and I would have fallen if he hadn't caught my elbow, his hand warm and steady against my cold skin. "This is your fault," I breathed, unable to process the full horror of what he was saying. "You put us in danger just by helping us." "Yes," he said without hesitation, without trying to deflect or minimize, "which is why I'm going to fix it." And his grip on my elbow tightened slightly as if he could hold me together through sheer force of will. The darkness around us felt oppressive now, every shadow potentially hiding someone watching, and I thought about Lucas asleep upstairs, completely unaware that his life had been turned into a target. "Move into my property," Dante continued, his tone brooking no argument. "Secured building, penthouse level, protection 24/7. You continue your life, your jobs, Lucas's school, but with guards who know how to keep you safe." "Like prisoners," I said, the words bitter on my tongue. "Like we're criminals who need to be locked up because you couldn't leave well enough alone." "Like people I refuse to let be harmed because of me," he corrected. And there was steel in his voice now, underlying determination that suggested he'd already made this decision and was just waiting for me to catch up. "You don't understand what these people are capable of," he continued, releasing my elbow but staying close. "The Kozlovs don't negotiate. They don't show mercy. They use leverage, and they're very good at finding what people care about most." His eyes held mine in the dim light from the street lamp. "I won't let them use Lucas to get to me. I won't let them hurt either of you because I was careless enough to show interest." The rain drummed against the awning above us, creating a curtain that separated us from the rest of the world, and I felt trapped between impossible choices. My pride screamed to refuse, to tell him we'd take our chances, that we didn't need his protection or his guilt-driven charity, but my love for Lucas was stronger than any pride. I thought about those men in the coffee shop, about the violence I'd witnessed, about Russian mobsters who might see my brother as nothing more than a tool to hurt Dante Moretti. "How long?" I asked finally, my voice small. "How long would we have to live like that?" "Until I end this," he said simply. "Until the Kozlovs are no longer a threat. Until I can guarantee your safety without constant surveillance." Days, weeks, months, I don't know, but I promise you'll be protected every moment. I refused initially, shaking my head and stepping back from him because this was insane. We couldn't just uproot our entire lives because of some theoretical danger from people I'd never met. Dante didn't argue, didn't push or threaten. He just reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, cream-colored and water-spotted from the rain, and handed it to me with an expression that made my stomach drop. I opened it with trembling fingers, and the world tilted sideways as I saw what was inside. Photos. Dozens of them. Surveillance photos of Lucas and me going about our normal routines. But these weren't Dante's photos. The angle was wrong, the quality too grainy. Taken from vehicles and rooftops and distances that spoke of predators rather than protectors. Each one had a timestamp from the last 3 days, clinical documentation of our movements, and terror flooded through me so completely I thought I might vomit right there on the steps. These people had been tracking Lucas, my baby brother who trusted everyone and saw good in the world. They'd photographed him near his school, at the playground, walking home holding my hand, and they'd done it all without me noticing because I'd been too focused on Dante's obvious watchers to see the real threat. Dante's voice came quietly, carefully, like he was trying not to spook a frightened animal. "They don't know yet if you matter to me," he said. "Once they decide you might, once they determine your leverage worth using, they'll act, and they won't be gentle about it." My hands shook so badly the photos blurred, but one in particular caught my eye and made my blood freeze in my veins. It showed a man standing too close to Lucas at the park, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and Lucas was looking up at him with that open, friendly expression he got when adults paid attention to him. I remembered that day. It was Wednesday afternoon, and when I'd asked Lucas about his time at the park, he'd signed that a nice man had offered him candy, but Lucas knew not to take it because of stranger danger. I'd praised him for being smart and thought nothing more of it, but now I saw that innocent moment for what it really was. A test, a predator, checking to see how accessible my brother was, how easy it would be to take him. "When?" I asked, my voice shaking as badly as my hands. "When do we have to decide?" Dante stepped closer, and I didn't have the strength to move away. "I have a team ready now," he said gently. "Pack what you and Lucas need for a few days, clothes, school things, whatever will make him comfortable. We leave tonight." "Tonight?" I repeated stupidly, as if saying it would make it less real. "Maya," he said, and it was the first time he'd used my name, the first time I'd heard it in that whiskey voice. "Every hour you stay here is another hour they have to make their move, and I won't risk that. I won't risk him." He nodded toward my building, toward the apartment where Lucas slept peacefully, unaware that monsters were circling. The choice had been removed from my hands, not through force, but through the undeniable evidence that we were already in danger, that refusing Dante's help wasn't brave or independent. It was just stupid, and I couldn't be stupid when Lucas's life was on the line. I woke Lucas as gently as I could, signing in the dim glow of his nightlight that we were going on an adventure, that we needed to pack some things and go somewhere safe for a little while. He was sleepy, but excited in that way only children can be at 2 a.m, his eyes lighting up even as he rubbed them with small fists and asked if he could bring Mr. Hoppy, his stuffed rabbit. "Of course," I signed back, trying to keep my hands steady so he wouldn't see my fear. "We're bringing everything important." Dante's men moved through our apartment with practiced efficiency, and I tried not to think about these strangers seeing our poverty, our struggles, the way we lived in a space barely big enough for 2 people. They packed with surprising care, though, wrapping our few dishes in newspaper, boxing books with attention to keeping sets together, treating our threadbare belongings like they actually mattered. But it was Dante himself who caught my attention, who made my breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He was in Lucas's room, carefully boxing my brother's favorite items with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man who commanded criminals and inspired terror. I watched from the doorway as he picked up each toy, examined it, set it gently in the box like it was precious. And when he got to Lucas's books, he actually read the titles, selecting the ones with worn covers that showed they'd been read 100 times, the ones Lucas loved most. It was unexpectedly thoughtful, this dangerous man understanding without being told which items would matter to an 8-year-old boy in a strange new place, and I found myself watching him rather than supervising his men, cataloging the way his large hands handled small things with such care. The intimacy of having him in our space was overwhelming, seeing him surrounded by our life, by every choice I'd made to stretch dollars and create comfort from nothing, by the photos on walls and the hand-me-down furniture I'd cleaned until it shined, and the visible evidence of how hard I'd tried to give Lucas a home. Lucas appeared beside me in his pajamas, Mr. Hoppy clutched to his chest, and his hands moved in sleepy signs. "Is the nice man from Coffee coming too?" he asked, and I hesitated because I didn't know how to explain that the nice man was the reason we were leaving, that he was both our danger and our salvation. Dante must have seen the exchange because he crossed the room and knelt to Lucas's level, his hands moving into signs that were becoming achingly familiar. "I'll make sure you're safe," he signed, his expression serious but warm. "Promise." And he held out his pinky finger the way kids do for pinky swears. Lucas's face lit up completely, and he wrapped his tiny pinky around Dante's much larger one, sealing a promise that seemed to mean everything to my brother, and clearly cost Dante something to make. I watched them together, this Mafia boss and my innocent brother, and felt my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, because how could I hate a man who understood instinctively what Lucas needed, who treated a child's promise with the same gravity he probably gave to business deals worth millions? We arrived at a luxury building in the financial district just as dawn was breaking, and I felt like Alice falling through the looking glass into a world that couldn't possibly be real. The lobby was all marble and modern art, with a doorman who nodded respectfully at Dante and didn't even blink at our disheveled appearance or the parade of men carrying our boxes. We took a private elevator, just the three of us, and I watched the numbers climb higher than I'd ever been in my life, until we reached the penthouse floor, and the doors opened directly into an apartment that stole my breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city sprawling below us, lights glittering like scattered diamonds, and everything inside was cream and chrome and tasteful art that probably cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime. 3 bedrooms, Dante had said, but I hadn't imagined this. More space than I'd ever inhabited, rooms that flowed into each other with an openness that felt almost frightening after our cramped apartment. Lucas was delighted, his exhaustion forgotten as he ran from room to room, his footsteps silent on plush carpet, and I watched him discover each new wonder with a mixture of joy and heartbreak, because this wasn't ours, this was borrowed, temporary, a beautiful cage we'd have to leave eventually. But then I started noticing details that made my chest tighten with emotions I couldn't name. Children's books in ASL stacked on shelves in what was clearly meant to be Lucas's room. Not just any books, but specific titles I recognized as his favorites, and some I'd wanted to buy him but couldn't afford. Toys appropriate for his age scattered artfully around, building blocks and art supplies, and a collection of stuffed animals that included 3 different rabbits, because someone had noticed Mr. Hoppy. Even a nightlight, shaped like stars, sat on the bedside table, ready to be plugged in, and I realized Dante had prepared all of this before we'd even agreed to come. The kindness from a criminal overwhelmed me completely, making my eyes burn with tears I refused to shed because I couldn't process this, couldn't reconcile the man who'd investigated my life and the man who'd bought my brother's star-shaped nightlights. Lucas signed excitedly that this was the best adventure ever, and I managed to smile while my heart cracked open. "This is too much," I said to Dante, who'd been standing by the windows giving us space to explore, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is safety," he replied, moving closer. "The rest is just—" He paused, his jaw working like he was trying to find words. I wanted Lucas to be comfortable. His voice softened noticeably when he said my brother's name, a tenderness that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. I looked around at everything he'd done, at the care he'd taken with details he had no obligation to consider, at the way he'd thought about what an 8-year-old deaf boy might need to feel safe in a strange place. Maya, he continued when I didn't respond, his green eyes holding mine with uncomfortable intensity. I know what it's like to be somewhere unfamiliar and afraid. I know what Isabella needed when she was scared, and Lucas deserves to feel safe, not like a prisoner or a burden. The mention of his sister's name made everything click into place, and I realized this wasn't just about protecting us or managing a threat. This was about Dante trying to give Lucas what he'd failed to give Isabella, trying to rewrite history through my brother's comfort. The first morning I woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant sound of something clattering in what I assumed was the kitchen, and for a disoriented moment I couldn't remember where I was or why everything felt so soft and expensive. Then it all came rushing back. The photos, the midnight move, the penthouse that was now our gilded cage, and I threw on clothes and rushed out to check on Lucas. What I found stopped me in the doorway, my heart doing something complicated in my chest that I absolutely did not want to examine. Dante stood at the massive kitchen island in jeans and a soft gray Henley, the first time I'd seen him in anything but suits, and he looked more human somehow, younger and less dangerous with his hair slightly mussed and his sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He was attempting pancakes, clearly unpracticed, frowning at the griddle like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, and the scene was so domestic and impossible that I almost laughed. Then Lucas appeared, drawn by the smell of breakfast, or maybe just his uncanny sense for finding trouble, and his face lit up when he saw Dante struggling with the batter. My brother didn't hesitate, just climbed up on the stool beside Dante and started signing instructions, showing him how I made them at home, how much batter to pour and when to flip, and how to tell when they were done. The two of them communicated entirely in ASL, and I watched from the doorway as Dante followed Lucas's directions with complete seriousness, treating my 8-year-old brother like a master chef whose expertise he genuinely needed. They laughed when Dante made mistakes in his signing, his fingers fumbling through unfamiliar culinary terms, and Lucas corrected him with the patient superiority only children can manage. "You're silly," Lucas signed, giggling silently. "That sign means bathroom, not blueberry." And I watched Dante's face transform with a grin that made him look almost boyish. "Your sister will never let me forget this," Dante signed back, glancing toward the doorway where I stood, and his eyes found mine with a warmth that sent heat flooding through me. "You're right about that," I said aloud, my voice rougher than I intended, unable to stay silent any longer while watching this impossible scene unfold. The morning light made everything golden, softening edges and making this feel like a real moment in a real life rather than a temporary arrangement born from danger. The smell of coffee and slightly burnt pancakes filled the space, mixed with Lucas's silent laughter that I could read in the way his shoulders shook and his eyes crinkled, and I felt my carefully maintained resistance beginning to crumble like sand against waves. This was exactly what I'd feared. Not the danger or the luxury or even the loss of freedom, but this feeling of rightness, of family, of watching Lucas bond with someone who could actually hurt us more than any Russian mobster ever could. Dante plated the pancakes with exaggerated care, presenting them to Lucas like a 5-star meal, and my brother applauded enthusiastically before dousing them in enough syrup to constitute a health hazard. "Come eat," Dante signed to me, "before they get cold." And there was something in his expression, vulnerable and hopeful, that made me unable to refuse, even though sitting down to breakfast with him felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. While Lucas was with the tutors Dante had arranged, specialized educators for deaf children who appeared at 9 in the morning like magic, I found myself alone in the penthouse with questions burning holes in my mind. The computer in Dante's study was top of the line, and I hesitated only a moment before opening the browser and typing Isabella Moretti into the search bar, needing to understand the ghost that haunted the man who'd upended our lives. The articles I found made my chest ache with a grief that wasn't even mine. Isabella Moretti, deaf from birth, youngest child of Antonio Moretti, died at 16 in what the carefully worded news reports called an unfortunate incident. But what I could read between the lines was murder. She'd been caught in crossfire during a rival family's attack, shot 3 times while at her brother's home where she was supposed to be safe, and she'd died before the ambulance arrived despite Dante's desperate attempts to save her. I found a photo of her, all dark curls and bright eyes, signing something to the camera with a smile that reminded me painfully of Lucas. And I understood suddenly why Dante had looked at my brother with such naked longing. The timeline made it worse. Dante had been 24, newly taking over the family business after their father's death just months before, and Isabella had been living with him because their mother couldn't handle her husband's murder and a deaf teenage daughter alone. Every article I found included quotes from unnamed sources saying Dante blamed himself, that he'd promised his father he'd protect Isabella, that his guilt had transformed him from a reluctant heir into the ruthless leader he was now. His obsession with protecting Lucas and me wasn't just guilt, I realized, as pieces fell into place. It was prevention. It was refusing to fail again. It was seeing a second chance to save someone he'd lost and being unable to walk away. I was so absorbed in reading about the attack, about how Dante had held his sister while she bled out, signing promises he couldn't keep about saving her, that I didn't hear him enter the study. His voice made me jump, tight and controlled in a way that suggested he was holding back something bigger. "You could have just asked," he said from the doorway, and I turned to see him staring at the computer screen where Isabella's photo smiled eternally. "Would you have told me?" I asked, closing the laptop slowly like that could somehow undo my invasion of his privacy. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, his hands clenched at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from some action. "Probably not," he finally admitted, moving into the room with careful steps. "Some pain is private, not meant to be shared or examined or used to understand someone." "But I needed to understand," I said quietly. "Needed to know why you're doing all this, why Lucas matters so much to you." He sank into the chair across from me, suddenly looking exhausted despite the early hour. "She was at my home because I promised I could keep her safe," he said, his voice hollow. "I had the best security, the most loyal men, and I swore to my dying father that Isabella would never be touched by this life." His hands moved unconsciously into signs as he spoke. "She was just starting to think about college, about a future, and I failed her completely." Dinner that evening was an elaborate affair because Dante had ordered from 5 different restaurants to ensure Lucas had options he'd like. And our dining table looked like a buffet with Italian, Thai, Mexican, American comfort food, and even sushi spread across its gleaming surface. Lucas was delighted by the choices, sampling from different containers with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could muster. And I was trying not to think about how much this casual gesture of abundance must have cost. Then Lucas's hands started moving in the candlelight, and I felt my face flush hot as I read his signs. "Is Dante your boyfriend?" he asked with the blunt curiosity of children who haven't learned that some questions are complicated. "Because you act like Sarah's mom and her boyfriend act." I denied it immediately, my hands probably moving too fast as I signed back that no, Dante was just helping us, that we were friends at most, that Lucas shouldn't get confused about the situation. But my brother had always been perceptive beyond his years, and his next signs made my stomach flip. "He looks at you like the prince looks at the princess in my stories," Lucas signed matter-of-factly. "And you smile different when he's here. Softer, like you do in pictures with Mom before she got sick." I was flustered completely, my face burning because out of the mouths of babes came truths I wasn't ready to examine. And I could feel Dante's eyes on us from across the table, even though I refused to look at him. Dante must have noticed our exchange growing animated because his hands lifted in question. "What's the discussion?" he signed, his expression curious and slightly amused, and I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. Lucas, with the innocent honesty that made children both wonderful and terrifying, turned to Dante and signed clearly, "I asked if you love my sister." The silence that followed was deafening despite the fact that none of us were speaking aloud, and I stared at my plate like it held the secrets of the universe, while my heart hammered against my ribs. Dante recovered first, his composure somehow intact, even though I could see tension in his shoulders. "Your sister is extraordinary," he signed to Lucas with careful deliberation. "Any man would be lucky to earn her love." He didn't answer the question, I noticed. Didn't confirm or deny. Just deflected with a compliment that made my skin tingle with awareness. Lucas nodded like this made perfect sense, then returned to his dinner completely satisfied, while I still couldn't meet Dante's eyes across the table. The air between us felt charged with everything unsaid, with the question hanging unanswered, with the growing tension neither of us seemed able to ignore, and I knew with sinking certainty that my brother had just forced us to acknowledge something we'd both been desperately trying to avoid. I could feel Dante's gaze on me, could sense him willing me to look up, but I kept my attention fixed on food I could no longer taste, while my mind raced with implications I wasn't ready to face. Dante's phone rang during dinner, the sound cutting through our careful normalcy like a blade, and I watched his expression harden from warm to granite in the space between one breath and the next. He glanced at the screen, and something flickered across his face that made my stomach drop, fear or fury or both, before he controlled it with visible effort. His hands moved in quick signs to Lucas. "I need to talk to your sister, private. Can you play in your room for a few minutes?" Lucas looked between us with those two perceptive eyes, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere, but he nodded and took his plate with him, leaving Dante and me alone in the suddenly oppressive silence. Dante answered the call, listened for maybe 10 seconds, then ended it without saying a word, his jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle jumping. "The Kozlovs made contact," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "They know you're here." My blood turned to ice in my veins, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. "How?" I managed to ask. "How could they possibly know?" He pulled out his phone again, tapped the screen, then turned it to face me, and what I saw made bile rise in my throat. A photo, clearly taken that morning, of the nonprofit where I worked, showing children arriving for class, their small forms vulnerable and exposed, and the implication was crystal clear. They could reach anywhere, hurt anyone, and they wanted me to know it. "The children at my work," I started, panic rising like a tide. "Those kids are deaf. They're vulnerable. If something happens because of me." "Already have protection," Dante cut me off, his fingers already moving across his phone screen. "I'm moving teams there now. Additional security at every entrance, plainclothes guards in the building. No one gets close to those children." The safety of the penthouse suddenly felt thin as paper, and I realized that all this luxury and all these locked doors meant nothing against people who could photograph vulnerable children as a message. Dante was making calls in rapid Italian, his voice sharp with command, and I watched his men mobilize through the windows, black cars pulling up to the building, figures moving with military precision. "You can't guard an entire nonprofit," I said, hearing the helplessness in my own voice. "You can't protect everyone I've ever known or every place I've ever been. This is impossible." He ended his call and moved around the table to me, his green eyes blazing with an intensity that stole my breath. "Watch me," he said, each word deliberate and weighted with promise. "I have resources you can't imagine, people in every corner of this city, and I will burn every dollar and call in every favor to keep you and everyone you care about safe." His hands came up to frame my face, thumbs brushing my cheekbones, and the tenderness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the violence in his words. "The Kozlovs think they can use your compassion against you, think they can threaten children to make you vulnerable. They don't understand that threatening what you love only makes me more dangerous." I stared up at him, seeing the full extent of his power on display, the ruthless criminal who commanded an empire, showing me exactly what he was willing to do. And I should have been terrified, but instead I felt something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like trust. That night, sleep was impossible, my mind racing with images of children in danger, and Russian mobsters with cameras, and the look on Dante's face when he'd promised to protect everyone I cared about. I gave up trying around 2 in the morning and wandered through the dark penthouse, checking on Lucas twice before I noticed the balcony door slightly ajar, letting in cool October air. I found Dante standing at the railing, smoke curling from a cigarette held loosely in his fingers, staring out at the city that sprawled below us like a living organism of light and shadow. He didn't turn when I stepped outside, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly in acknowledgement, and I moved to stand beside him in silence, the night air raising goosebumps on my arms through my thin sleep shirt. We stood together, not touching, separated by inches that felt like miles, and the city sounds were muted this high up, just the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind between buildings. Stars were barely visible through the light pollution, the sky more orange than black, and I found myself searching for constellations I couldn't see. "I'm terrified I'll fail again," Dante said suddenly, his voice rough like the words had been dragged out of him against his will. "That I'll lose someone else, He stopped abruptly, taking a drag from his cigarette like he could inhale the rest of the sentence. "Someone else you what?" I prompted quietly, turning to look at his profile, all sharp angles and shadows in the darkness. He looked at me then, and his eyes held something raw and unguarded that I'd never seen before. "Someone else I care about," he finished, and the admission hung between us, heavy with meaning. "You can't control everything," I said, and the words felt inadequate but true. No matter how much power you have or how many men you command, you can't prevent every possible threat. He let out a bitter laugh, crushing out his cigarette against the railing. "I've built an empire on controlling everything," he said. "Every variable, every risk, every possible outcome. That's how you survive in my world, by controlling what others can't." "And yet here we are," I countered, feeling bolder in the darkness. "You can't control what I feel, what Lucas feels, whether we stay or go after this is over. You can't force us to care about you no matter how many threats you eliminate." The power dynamic shifted in that moment, and I saw him recognize it, saw understanding dawn that for all his resources and influence, he had no power over the thing he seemed to want most. "Maya," he started, then stopped, his hand coming up to run through his hair in a gesture of frustration I'd never seen from him. "I care about you both," he said finally, "more than I should, more than is safe for any of us. And it terrifies me because caring is vulnerability, and vulnerability gets people killed in my world." The honesty in his voice made my chest tight, and I found myself stepping closer despite every warning signal in my brain. "Then maybe you need to decide if we're worth that risk," I said softly. "If what you feel is worth being terrified. Because we can't be another Isabella for you to protect out of guilt. This has to be more than that, or it's nothing at all." The tension between us pulled taut like a wire stretched to breaking, and then suddenly it snapped. Dante turned to me, his hands coming up to cup my face with surprising gentleness, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones, while his eyes searched mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his face so close I could feel his breath warm against my lips. "Tell me this is wrong and I'll walk away. I'll keep you safe from a distance and never touch you again." I should have told him to stop, should have listened to the rational part of my brain screaming warnings about criminals and danger and Lucas, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed the distance between us, and the kiss was electric, desperate, full of all the longing we'd both been denying since that first moment in the coffee shop. His hand slid into my hair while mine fisted in his shirt, and I felt like I was falling and flying at the same time, like every nerve ending in my body had suddenly come alive after years of numbness. Then reality crashed in like a bucket of ice water, and I pulled back abruptly, my hands pushing against his chest, even as my body protested the separation. "This is insane," I said, my voice shaking. "You're a criminal. You hurt people. You operate outside every law and moral boundary, and I have Lucas to think about. I can't." His hands dropped from my face like I'd burned him, and he stepped back, putting distance between us that felt both necessary and devastating. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You think I want to feel this way about someone I'm putting in danger just by caring? You think I plan to fall for a woman whose brother reminds me every day of what I failed to protect?" The admission hung in the air between us, the first time either of us had acknowledged that this was more than attraction or convenience or proximity. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the relatively mild night. "What happens when this is over?" I asked, forcing myself to voice the question that had been haunting me. "When the threat is gone and we're safe, and you've paid your debt to your guilt, what then?" "Is that what you want?" Dante asked, his green eyes blazing in the darkness. "For this to be over? For me to set you up somewhere safe and disappear from your life like none of this happened?" I opened my mouth to answer, to say yes because that was the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that would protect Lucas and my heart and our future. But the word wouldn't come. I stood there silent, my inability to answer, speaking louder than any words could have, and I saw understanding dawn on Dante's face. "You can't answer," he said softly, stepping closer again, "because you don't want it to be over any more than I do, and that scares you because it should be simple. You should want to get away from me." "It terrifies me," I admitted, my voice breaking, "because I'm falling for you, and that's the most dangerous thing that's happened since this whole nightmare started. More dangerous than Russian mobsters or threats or any of it." The next morning I woke to Lucas's small hand shaking my shoulder, and the moment I saw his flushed face and glassy eyes, panic seized my chest in a grip that made it hard to breathe. He had a high fever, his forehead burning under my palm, and he was lethargic in a way that brought back every terrifying memory of his childhood illness when he was 4 and his immune system had crashed. I was frantic immediately, my mind racing through options while my hands signed questions he was too tired to fully answer. He needed a doctor, but going to a hospital felt dangerous, exposed, and I was paralyzed by fear and indecision when Dante appeared in the doorway already on his phone. "My personal physician will be here in 20 minutes, he said, reading the panic on my face. "He's bringing everything we might need, and Maya, Lucas will be fine, I promise." The doctor arrived in 15 minutes, a distinguished older man with kind eyes who immediately put Lucas at ease despite the circumstances, and I watched medical equipment appear as if by magic. Anything Lucas might need manifesting, because Dante had the resources to make it happen instantly. But what broke something inside me wasn't the efficiency or the expensive care. It was watching Dante sit beside Lucas's bed while the doctor examined him, his hands moving through signs to tell my brother stories about a brave knight and a dragon. Lucas was sick and scared, but Dante's presence seemed to calm him, those large, dangerous hands forming gentle signs that distracted from the thermometer and the stethoscope and the finger prick for blood work. I stood in the doorway of Lucas's room, with afternoon light streaming through windows, watching this scene that shouldn't be possible. This mafia boss who killed people and controlled criminal empires being so incredibly tender with my sick brother. The way Dante signed showed practice and care, his stories elaborate and funny, making Lucas smile even through his fever, and I could see my brother's complete trust in every response, every question, every time his small hand reached for Dante's larger one. Something in me broke watching them together, the last wall of my resistance crumbling like sand, because this wasn't obligation or guilt or even attraction anymore. This was real care, real affection, real love showing itself in actions rather than words. Lucas's hands moved weakly, his signing slower than usual but clear enough. "Will you stay until I feel better?" he asked Dante, and I held my breath waiting for the answer. "I'm not going anywhere," Dante signed back, his expression solemn and sincere. "I promise. I'll be right here." Then he looked up and met my eyes across the room, and when he spoke it was to me. "Neither of you are alone in this," he said, his voice carrying a weight of commitment that felt like a vow. "Whatever Lucas needs, whatever you need, I'm here. Not because I have to be, but because I choose to be." The doctor finished his examination and prescribed antibiotics and rest, assuring me that Lucas would be fine in a few days. But I barely heard him because I was still locked in Dante's gaze, still processing the shift that had just occurred in my heart. The moment when caring had transformed into something deeper and more terrifying and infinitely more real. While Lucas slept with his fever finally broken, his small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of healing sleep, I found myself walking to Dante's study with a determination that overrode my exhaustion and fear. I closed the door behind me, the soft click seeming to seal us into a space where pretense couldn't survive. And when I spoke, my voice was steadier than I felt. "I need to understand," I said, watching him look up from papers scattered across his desk. "Why us, really? Not the guilt or the protection or Isabella. Why do you care so much about two people you barely know?" He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour, shadows under his eyes and tension in every line of his body, and when he answered, his voice was raw with honesty. "Because when I saw Lucas sign, I saw Isabella," he said, leaning back in his chair, like the weight of the admission physically pressed on him. "When I looked at you, I saw everything I've never let myself want, softness and goodness, and a life that isn't built on violence and fear." He stood, moving around the desk with slow, deliberate steps. "I've tried to stay distant," he continued, "tried to keep this professional, just protection and obligation, but I failed completely because every time Lucas looks at me with trust, or you smile despite being afraid, I want things I have no right to want." The confession hung between us heavy with implications, and I found myself moving toward him without conscious decision. "I've killed men," he said, meeting my eyes with unflinching honesty. "I've done unforgivable things in the name of power and revenge and family legacy. But with you and Lucas, I want to be the man I was before this life consumed me, before Isabella died, and I decided being ruthless was safer than being human." I crossed the remaining distance and took his hands in mine, feeling the calluses and scars that told stories of violence, feeling them tremble slightly at my touch. "I'm terrified of this," I admitted, my throat tight with emotion, "of you, of what I feel, of how fast this is happening and how much it could hurt." "So am I," Dante said softly, his fingers tightening around mine. "I'm terrified that caring about you will get you killed, that my world will destroy the best thing that's happened to me in a decade." "Lucas loves you already," I said, the words coming out broken because it was true and beautiful and devastating all at once. That should scare me more than anything, my brother attaching himself to someone so dangerous. "Does it?" Dante asked, searching my face. "Does it scare you that he loves me?" "No," I whispered. "What scares me is that I think I'm falling too, that I'm falling for a man who operates outside every moral boundary I have, who could break us both without meaning to, and I can't seem to stop myself." Dante's hands released mine only to come up and frame my face, tilting it so I had to meet his eyes. "I'm falling too," he said, his voice barely audible. "Falling for a woman who sees the monster I am, and somehow still looks at me like I could be something better. And it terrifies me because I don't know how to protect you from myself." Dante pulled me to the couch in his study, and I watched as he spread documents across the coffee table, legal papers and contracts and business proposals that spoke of something I hadn't expected. "This isn't just about ending the Kozlov threat," he said, his finger tracing organizational charts that showed legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, investment firms. I've been working on this for years, slowly transferring power, building legal operations that can sustain everything without the criminal foundation. I stared at the papers, seeing the complexity of his world laid bare, the intelligence required to build and maintain an empire both legal and illegal, and the meticulous planning that went into separating one from the other. Meeting you and Lucas, he continued, looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. You've made it urgent, made me realize I don't want to spend another decade doing this. I want out while I'm still young enough to have a real life. In 6 months, I could be mostly legitimate, he explained, pointing to timelines and transfer agreements, enough that the family name means business rather than crime, enough that maybe, possibly, I could have something real. You'd do that? I asked, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. Walk away from all this power, from the control you said you built your whole life around? I'd do it for a chance at something real, Dante said, his hand finding mine among the papers, for morning pancakes with Lucas, for the right to love you without fear that my world will destroy yours, for the possibility of being the man you and your brother deserve rather than the monster I've become. The documents showed shell corporations being dissolved, illegal operations being transferred to associates who would take them legitimate or shut them down, investments in technology and real estate, and restaurants that had nothing to do with crime. For morning pancakes with Lucas, I repeated softly, the simple domesticity of it making my eyes burn with tears I refused to shed. You'd give up everything for breakfast and a little boy's laughter? For you, he corrected, turning to face me fully. I'd give up everything for you. Lucas is part of that because he's part of you. Because watching you love him showed me what I want my life to look like, and it doesn't look like this anymore. He gestured to the papers, to the evidence of his criminal empire. It looks like waking up next to someone who sees me, really sees me, and chooses me anyway. It looks like teaching your brother to make pancakes and signing bedtime stories, and being someone worth the trust you're both giving me. Hope bloomed in my chest, fragile and terrifying, because he was offering me something I'd thought impossible. A future where this dangerous attraction could become something real and lasting. 6 months, I said, testing the timeline. Half a year to completely transform your life? It's aggressive, he admitted, but I have motivation now, something worth racing toward instead of just running from the past. And Maya, I will make this work because the alternative is unthinkable. I woke to cold concrete beneath me and the acrid smell of oil and decay filling my nostrils, my head pounding from whatever drug they'd used to knock me out. Panic flooded through me immediately, and I sat up too fast, the world spinning as I searched frantically for Lucas. He was huddled against the wall a few feet away, his small body shaking with silent sobs, and I crawled to him on hands that scraped against rough concrete, pulling him into my arms. My hands moved through signs even as my vision swam, telling him I was here, that we'd be okay, lies that I needed him to believe even if I didn't. The warehouse around us was massive and dark, dim light filtering through grimy windows high above, and the industrial area outside was silent except for distant traffic that offered no hope of rescue. One of Dante's trusted men, Marco, had betrayed us, I realized with sickening clarity. The security had been drugged, access codes given, and we'd been taken while Dante was at a meeting across town, probably planned that way, timed perfectly to when he couldn't protect us. Lucas's hands moved against my chest, signing questions I couldn't fully answer, asking where we were and where Dante was, and if the bad men were going to hurt us. I kept my face calm for him, signing reassurances with steady hands, even though my terror was a living thing clawing at my throat, because keeping Lucas calm was the only thing I could control in this nightmare. Footsteps echoed across the concrete, and an older man emerged from the shadows, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light and his cold eyes assessing us like we were merchandise. Viktor Kozlov, I knew without being told, The man whose rivalry with Dante had turned Lucas and me into targets, and the cruelty in his smile made my blood run cold. Moretti cares for you, he said, his accent thick and his English precise. That makes you valuable. Leverage he cannot ignore. I pulled Lucas closer, positioning myself between him and this monster. You will call Moretti, Kozlov continued, pulling out a phone. Tell him you'll die unless he surrenders his territory, his operations, everything he's built. Tell him the price of your life is his empire. He won't do that for me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We're nobody to him, just people he's protecting out of guilt. Kozlov's smile widened, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. Then I'll start with the boy, he said casually, as if discussing the weather rather than murdering a child, and we'll see how long Moretti's resolve lasts when he hears the screams. Lucas couldn't hear the threat, but he felt my body tense, and his hands signed frantically asking what the man had said. I signed back that everything was fine, that Dante would come, my fingers forming lies in the cold darkness, while my mind raced for any possible escape. The safety of the penthouse felt like a distant dream now, all of Dante's promises and protection stripped away by betrayal, and I realized with devastating clarity that we were completely alone, that no amount of love or good intentions could save us from the reality of Dante's world, a world where children were collateral and mercy didn't exist. I arrived at the penthouse to find carnage that made my vision blur red with rage and terror, bodies of my guards scattered across the marble floors, wounded but not dead, because Marco had apparently retained some twisted sense of mercy even in his betrayal. The security system had been completely compromised, drugged and disabled, with the kind of inside knowledge only my most trusted men possessed, and when I reached the empty bedrooms where Maya and Lucas should have been sleeping safely, my control shattered like glass under a hammer. This was my nightmare made flesh. Isabella's death repeating with different players, the same crushing failure to protect someone I loved, and the fury that roared through me was matched only by the terror that threatened to drag me under. I called in every resource I had, every favor owed, every connection built over decades, and I became the man I'd tried to hide from Maya, the dangerous criminal who'd built an empire on fear and violence, and the willingness to do whatever it took. Men mobilized within minutes, my phone lighting up with confirmations as tactical teams assembled, weapons were distributed, and the full force of my organization focused on a single goal, finding them before Kozlov could use them against me, or worse. I tracked Marco down in less than 3 hours, found him hiding in a safe house he thought I didn't know about, and when my men dragged him before me beaten and broken, I felt nothing but cold calculation. You took them from me, I said, my voice deadly calm despite the rage burning in my chest. The only things that matter, the only good things I've had in 10 years, and you sold them for what? Money? Marco's face was swollen, blood dripping from his split lip, but he managed to speak through broken teeth. Kozlov offered millions, he said. Enough to disappear. To start over somewhere you'd never find me. He said you were getting soft, that the woman and kid made you weak. I would burn every dollar I have to ash for them, I said, crouching so he could see the truth in my eyes. I would set fire to my entire empire, give up every shred of power, live in poverty for the rest of my life if it meant they were safe. You chose wrong, Marco. You bet on the wrong side. My hands were covered in his blood, but I didn't care, couldn't care about anything except getting the location out of him before it was too late. He gave it up eventually. They always did when they understood that death would be a mercy I wasn't offering. An abandoned warehouse in the industrial district where Kozlov was holding them, waiting for my surrender. I left Marco to my men and gathered my forces, checking weapons with hands that should have shaken but remained steady through years of practice. The warehouse was 20 minutes away, 20 minutes during which anything could happen, and I forced myself not to think about Lucas terrified or Maya hurt. Forced myself into the cold tactical mindset that had kept me alive this long. I was coming for them, and God help anyone who stood in my way, because the man who'd made pancakes and signed bedtime stories was gone, replaced by the monster who'd do anything, sacrifice anyone, destroy everything to save the two people who'd made him want to be human again. Dante's team stormed the warehouse with the kind of professional violence that spoke of years of training and absolute loyalty, and I heard the chaos erupting around us, gunfire and shouting, and the sounds of Kozlov's men being systematically neutralized. I kept Lucas pressed against me, my body curved around his to shield him from whatever was coming, and I signed into his hair that it would be over soon, that we were going to be okay, even though I had no right to promise anything. Then I heard footsteps running toward us, different from the others, and I looked up to see Dante crossing the warehouse floor, his face a mask of controlled fury that shattered the moment his eyes found us alive. The relief that flooded his expression broke through all his careful control, transforming him from the dangerous criminal to the man who'd made us pancakes and learned what Lucas needed to feel safe. He dropped to his knees in front of us, and his hands immediately moved into signs, even as his voice spoke words I could barely process through my shock. "I'm sorry," his fingers formed with desperate precision. "So sorry I let this happen. I promised to keep you safe and I failed." Lucas launched himself at Dante, his small arms wrapping around that strong neck, and I felt Dante's arms come around both of us, pulling us into an embrace that felt like coming home after being lost in darkness. Lucas was crying silently against Dante's shoulder, his whole body shaking with the release of fear, and I was shaking too, my hands fisting in Dante's shirt while I tried to remember how to breathe. The chaos of the aftermath swirled around us, Kozlov's men being subdued and secured, police sirens wailing in the distance, though I knew Dante had that handled. But our reunion was an island of stillness in the storm. "You came," I whispered against his shoulder, stating the obvious because I needed to say something, needed to ground myself in the reality of his presence. "Did you doubt?" Dante asked, pulling back just enough to see my face, his hands coming up to check me for injuries, with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence he'd just orchestrated. "No," I said, and the certainty in my voice surprised me. "I knew you'd come, knew you wouldn't stop until you found us." The certainty in my answer meant everything. I could see it in the way his eyes closed briefly, in the way his jaw unclenched slightly, in the way he pressed his forehead against mine like he needed the physical contact to believe we were real. Lucas's hands moved between us, signing that he'd been so scared, but he'd known Dante would save us, because Dante had promised. I watched Dante sign back with one hand while keeping the other arm locked around us, watched him promise that no one would ever take them again, that he'd failed once but never again, and I believed him completely despite everything, despite the danger and the violence and the impossibility of our situation, because some truths were undeniable, and Dante's love for us was one of them. Lucas needed medical observation at a private hospital that appeared within minutes of Dante making a single phone call, his influence opening doors that should have required paperwork and insurance and hours of waiting. My brother was being treated for shock and dehydration, tucked into a bed that probably cost more per night than my monthly rent, and while he slept under the watchful eye of nurses who moved with quiet efficiency, Dante and I finally had the conversation I'd been avoiding since the rescue. "I can't do this," I said, the words coming out flat and exhausted, and I watched Dante's face drain of color, watched his whole body go rigid like I'd struck him. "Can't do what?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was bracing for a blow. "I can't keep Lucas in a world where he gets kidnapped," I continued, my hands twisting together in my lap, "where men with guns are normal, where his safety depends on how well a criminal organization can protect him. He deserves better than living in fear." I paused, forcing myself to meet Dante's eyes. "We both do." The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we'd been through, and I watched emotions flicker across his face too fast to catalog. "You're right," he said finally, and the agreement surprised me. "He does deserve better. You both do." He took my hand, his grip warm and steady, despite the tremor I could feel in his fingers. "Let me give you better," he said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "I meant what I said about getting out, about legitimizing everything. We accelerate the timeline, 3 months instead of 6. I'll call in every favor, sell whatever I need to sell, do whatever it takes." "And I'm supposed to just trust that?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Trust that you'll actually walk away from everything you've built? That you won't get pulled back in the first time someone challenges you or needs something only the criminal version of you can provide?" "No," Dante said, his free hand coming up to cup my face. "You're supposed to trust this." He kissed my forehead with a tenderness that made my eyes burn with unshed tears. "I love you," he said against my skin. "Both of you. And I will prove it every day, not with words or promises, but with actions. With every business I legitimize, and every connection I sever, and every choice I make to be worthy of you." The hospital room felt surreal, this conversation happening while my brother slept, and monitors beeped softly, and the city lights glowed through windows, and I wanted desperately to believe him. 3 months, I repeated, testing the timeline. 90 days to completely transform your life? "I've already started," he said, pulling out his phone and showing me documents, transfer agreements dated from weeks ago, before we were taken, before the crisis, proof that he'd been working toward this future before I demanded it. "I was going to surprise you," he admitted, "was going to present you with a clean slate, and ask you properly to build a life with me. But then Kozlov happened, and now you need to see that I'm serious. That this isn't just reaction to trauma, but a real plan I've been executing." I stared at the documents, at the evidence of his commitment, and something in my chest loosened slightly. 3 months had passed like a dream, and I walked into the penthouse that was now unmistakably our home, not just Dante's space where Lucas and I were temporary guests, but a place where our lives had woven together until the seams were invisible. Maya's things were everywhere. My laptop from the nonprofit on the kitchen counter, my favorite mug in the sink, my jacket thrown over the back of the couch in a way that would have mortified me months ago, but now just felt like home. Lucas's art covered the refrigerator, drawings of the three of us holding hands, and fierce dragons, an elaborate cityscape signed with his careful handwriting, and even Dante's work had changed, no longer ominous manila folders, but what Lucas called boring business papers about real estate investments and restaurant franchises scattered across the dining table. It was autumn again, full circle from that morning in the coffee shop, but everything was different now, transformed by time and choice, and the deliberate work of building something real from impossible circumstances. Lucas's specialized school supplies sat ready for tomorrow, his backpack already packed because Dante had learned his routine and helped without being asked, and the whole space hummed with the energy of actual life being lived. I heard laughter from the kitchen before I saw them, Lucas's silent giggles that I could recognize by sound alone, and I rounded the corner to find absolute chaos. Dante and Lucas were attempting cookies, and the kitchen looked like a flower bomb had detonated, white powder covering every surface, and both of them dusted like ghosts. Lucas was perched on a stool, his hands moving in animated signs while Dante nodded seriously despite the smudge of chocolate on his cheek, and the domesticity of the scene made my heart swell until it hurt. Dante looked up when he sensed my presence, and his grin transformed his whole face, the dangerous criminal completely gone and replaced by a man who'd just spent an hour baking with an 8-year-old. "We made you something," he said aloud while his hands signed the same words for Lucas, and my brother bounced excitedly on his stool. "Dante says he has a question for you," Lucas signed, his eyes sparkling with a secret he was clearly bursting to share. "A big one, and you have to say yes because we already decided." Maya's heart raced, my pulse thundering in my ears as I looked between them. Dante nervous for the first time since I'd known him, his hands actually trembling slightly as he wiped them on a dish towel. "Lucas and I discussed this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We agree." And he pulled something from his pocket that caught the kitchen light and made my breath stop completely in my chest. Dante knelt on the flour-covered kitchen floor, and I watched through blurring vision as he pulled out a ring that caught the light and scattered it like promises across our makeshift family. But instead of speaking aloud, his hands lifted and began to move through signs, deliberately ensuring Lucas could participate fully in this moment that would change all our lives. Maya Rodriguez, his fingers formed with careful precision. "You've taught me that family isn't blood, it's choice. That love is built in ordinary moments like burned pancakes and bedtime stories. You and Lucas are my choice, every day for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" The tears came hot and fast, blurring my vision until I could barely see his face, and I nodded frantically because words felt inadequate for the enormity of what I was feeling. "Yes," I managed to choke out. "Yes, of course, yes." And Lucas launched himself at Dante with a squeal of delight that I felt more than heard. The three of us collapsed in a heap on the kitchen floor, a tangle of limbs and laughter and tears and flour that coated us all like snow, and it was messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Dante slipped the ring on my finger with shaking hands, and I noticed for the first time that it had 3 stones set in a row, emerald flanked by 2 smaller diamonds. "One for each of us," he signed with his free hand, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that stole my breath, "including Lucas, because he's mine too if you'll let me, not just yours but ours, a family we choose every single day." Lucas's hands moved excitedly between us, and I read his signs through my tears. "I told him you'd say yes," my brother signed with smug satisfaction. "I said you love him even when you're mad at him, and that means you'll marry him. I'm very smart." I laughed through my tears, the sound broken and joyful. "You asked my 8-year-old brother first," I said to Dante, unable to believe the thoughtfulness of it, the way he'd understood what would matter most. "He's the most important man in your life," Dante replied, brushing flour from my cheek with gentle fingers. "I needed his blessing, needed him to know that I'm not trying to take you away but to join what you've already built, to be part of your family, not replace it." Lucas signed proudly, sitting up straighter. "I said yes immediately," he told me, "because Dante makes you smile, and he knows all my favorite foods, and he promised to teach me to drive when I'm older. Also, he said I can be in the wedding and wear a fancy suit." We sat there on the kitchen floor, covered in flour, with burned cookies smoking slightly in the oven, and I realized this was exactly how our story was meant to go. Chaos transforming into beauty, danger becoming safety, a mistaken moment of sign language in a coffee shop leading to forever. Because sometimes the most impossible things turn out to be exactly what we needed all along. The morning light streaming through Riverside Coffee's windows was exactly the same as it had been 6 months ago, golden and warm and full of promise. But everything else had transformed completely. Maya walked in with Dante and Lucas, the three of them moving together with the easy rhythm of family, and the owner greeted them with genuine warmth that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with gratitude. Dante had paid for all the repairs after that terrible morning, had helped the owner reopen with better security and a generous investment, had turned violence into restoration. They ordered the same drinks from that first day, coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Lucas, a deliberate echo of the moment that had changed everything, and they took their table by the window where Lucas settled between them like he'd always belonged there. The smell of fresh espresso filled the air, familiar yet transformed by safety, by the knowledge that the men who'd burst through that door were gone, and the danger had passed, leaving only the memory of how fear had turned into love. Lucas was chattering in sign about his upcoming school presentation, his hands moving excitedly while Dante and Maya watched with the shared amusement of parents who found everything their child did endlessly fascinating. Then another customer across the shop started signing to their deaf friend, Fluid ASL, that caught Lucas's attention immediately, and his eyes went wide with the excitement of recognizing his language in the wild. Can I meet them? He signed to Maya, bouncing slightly in his seat. Please? Of course, Maya signed back, smiling as Lucas scrambled from his chair and rushed over to introduce himself with the fearless friendliness that came from knowing he was loved and protected. As they watched him engage the strangers in animated conversation, Dante took Maya's hand across the table, his thumb tracing the 3 stones of her engagement ring. Her hands lifted, signing across the small space between them. Thank you for that day, her fingers formed with emotion thick in every gesture, for being brave enough to sign to a scared little boy, for seeing us when you could have just walked away. Dante's response came in signs that had become as natural as breathing. Thank you for being worth becoming a better man for, he signed back. For teaching me that some things are worth more than power or control. For giving me a family when I thought I'd lost the right to have one. Lucas returned then, his face flushed with excitement, and his hands moving so fast they could barely keep up. They invited us to a deaf community picnic, he signed. Next Saturday. There will be other kids who sign and games and everything. Can we go, please? Maya and Dante exchanged looks across the table, the kind of silent communication that came from building a life together, and they smiled in perfect unison. We'd love to, Dante signed to Lucas, who squealed with delight. All of us, Maya added, her hand finding Dante's again, together, the way we do everything now. They sat there at their table, the 3 of them signing and laughing while morning light painted everything gold, and the coffee shop hummed with the ordinary magic of daily life. Dante caught Maya's eye across the table, and his hands moved in a sign that had become their private language, a callback to the moment everything began. You're beautiful, he signed casually, the same sign from that first impossible day. But now it was heavy with history and love and family and the future they were building together. Maya's heart swelled as she signed back with a grin. So are you, her fingers formed, and she meant it in every possible way, beautiful in his transformation, in his love, in the way he'd let them change him from a man built on violence into someone who made cookies and attended picnics and signed bedtime stories. Someone who'd proven that even the most impossible beginnings could lead to the most inevitable endings. That family was choice and love was action, and sometimes a wrong moment could turn out to be exactly right.